And welcome back to the classroom. My name is Mr. Wong. Today we're looking at Module 8, Applying Chemical Ideas. Inquiry Question 3, Chemical Synthesis and Design. I'm going to be going through this dot point here. We will try and split it into a couple of lessons, but we're going to talk about the main point when it comes to designing a chemical synthesis process. So talk about availability of reagents, conditions, yield purity, so on and so on. Okay, so we want to talk about factors that influence synthetic reactions. Obviously, we need to talk about what synthetic reactions are, and then we're going to evaluate some factors that will implement that. Your textbook reference are these pages here, so feel free to have a read as additional components. So let's look at some really important synthesis reactions, look at particular chemicals. So we have our selenic acid, that's used as a common pain relief tablet. We have penicillin, and it's great with as an antibiotic to treat bacterial infections. So these are some really fundamental medical related synthetic reactions. We also see it in common commercial use purposes as well. So we've talked about the different types of functional groups and all those different types of things there, but let's talk about what a synthesis reaction is. Synthesis reactions are chemical changes in which two or more reactants combine to form a single product. So a simple example is, as you recall in year 11 when we did the hydrogen pop test, we combine hydrogen gas and oxygen gas together to create water. Well, not to create water, but to form water. Okay, so that's a synthesis reaction, to make multiple things to form one thing there. So let's begin to look at factors that need to be considered when designing a chemical synthesis process. We're going to start with the environmental, social, and economics, and then we'll talk about the actual reaction itself, how that actually leads itself into what we need to talk about. So the first thing I want to talk about is the environmental impacts and factors that will affect synthesis processes. What we want to try and do is limit any negative impacts to the environment. So we talked about previously an example of the use of polymers, which is a synthesis reaction, if you recall, with the chain addition polymers and all that. Products need to be more biodegradable. So an example here, you have plastic cutlery that don't break down very well. Well, an actual company in India actually makes biodegradable spoons and forks and cutlery and all those kind of things. In fact, you can actually eat their cutlery, and also it's, as I said, it's biodegradable, so that's incredible. Reduce the production of greenhouse gases. As we know, when we burn fossil fuels to create plastics and all this, that generates a lot of greenhouse gases in the process. So that could be in the form of, converting to the use of electric vehicles instead of the internal combustion engine. But obviously, one of the things we need to take into account is the battery sources use lithium, and so that requires mining, so that could be an environment impact in itself. So I might just note that down as mining issues. So issues with mining process, and that can be a potential issue. Like I said, we can make biodegradable plastics, so with particular shopping bags, as you would know from Coles and Woolies, they're a lot more biodegradable or a lot useful in recycled use. It also means that they can break down into smaller components, so you don't have marine life choking in the water in this ocean. We have biodegradable cutlery, like I said before, so cutlery in which can break itself apart within 5 days of usage, or as one of the examples I talked about, you can actually eat the cutlery. I might put a link down to that video. It's actually quite interesting, so do check it out if you have time. Obviously, if we look at negative impacts of the synthesis reactions, one of the processes in fossil fuel industries and also production of plastics is sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide are produced as your byproducts. Now, sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide, or carbon dioxide is definitely a greenhouse gas, so it does contribute to enhanced climate change. So that does enhanced climate, or what we call the enhanced greenhouse effect. So that will enhance the effects of that. But if these two were to react with water in our atmosphere, it can actually create acids. So we can accidentally, if we're not too careful, or if we have a real high quantity of sulfur dioxide, it can react with the water in the air, from making it to sulfur trioxide. The sulfur trioxide then reacts with water to make sulfuric acid, and then obviously that acid, the release of the proton, will react with a lot of different buildings, natural environments, and it can be quite harmful to marine life. So what we know is crustaceans, so sea-shelled marine life, their overall shell structure will get smaller as the level of acidity in the water increases. I want to show you an example of where acid rain becomes an issue, because this is what we're talking about here. So acid rain, Queenstown, Tasmania, a nice little mining town over there. Within a couple of kilometers, or maybe a bit more than that, of the mining camp, there are no trees. Okay, so if you actually have a look at all this area, just for irony's sake, here's the green. You can see there's no trees at all in this image here. There's some trees here, but it's basically barren land. And there's a reason for that. Because of the incredible amounts of mining that occurred years before, they had a really high concentration of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, and it caused a really extended occurrence of acid rain. Now, what acid rain does is obviously it decays and deteriorates monuments, but at the same time also it can extract the nutrients away from the soil. So what you're actually seeing here is the soil is so malnutrition that you can't actually grow any form of trees in it, and it's still been like this for I think about 40 years, maybe a little bit more than that, but that's what we're seeing here. In terms of social factors, we need to consider a couple of things. We need to make sure that there is a responsible use of resource, so we're not overusing a particular resource to make this particular product. We need to follow relevant guidelines in production, so obviously ensuring it's ethical, there's no exploitation of workers, those kind of things. And we want an emphasis, obviously, for more individuals now than before. There must be some kind of benefits to the environment. So one example that we can talk about is more biodegradable detergents. Now, originally detergents, when first used, had a lot of phosphates. So older detergents had a high concentration of phosphate ions in their actual detergent. And what that actually leads to is, once it goes downstream in waterways, it can actually cause for algae bloom. And we'll talk about a little bit more what the issues with that is. But more biodegradable detergents, and we want less toxic pesticides. Obviously, the use of pesticides is to get rid of any unwanted pests in the household. It could be for farming and all that. But at the same time, if it's toxic, if the chemical used are highly toxic, it's not good for human use as well, because we're exposing ourselves to toxins when we're just trying to get rid of pests. So that's some of the social considerations we need to take into account when we make synthesis reactions. Let me show you an example of non-biodegradable detergents. Now what we do know is originally all the detergents had a really high concentration of phosphate ions in them. Now when phosphate ions are run down through the riverways and waterways, you get a thing called an algae bloom. Now algae is obviously, I can't remember which kingdom it is, plant kingdom. So it grows in waterways. The more phosphate ions there are, the more supply in which the algae can increase its population. And what actually happens as a consequence of an algae bloom, as they grow, they actually take in oxygen. So they take oxygen from the water or from whatever river system they're in, and by taking away the oxygen in the waterways, it causes the fish or any marine life in those waterways to essentially suffocate. And in that consequence, where a river has a really low concentration of dissolved oxygen or no oxygen at all, we get a thing called eutrophication. So when there is a very low concentration of dissolved oxygen, or none at all, as we said before. Some other impacts of pesticide, as you can see with this diagram here, obviously it's poor for soil, quality of air is not great for us either, and it's not always most efficient depending on the particular pesticide we use. If there's rain, that can be taken down into particular waterways, and we don't want that either. So that's why we also want to ensure that pesticides we use are less toxic in general, but still have a similar effect, which there are plenty of more natural options that can do that instead of the industrial toxic chemical versions of them. Okay, economic factors. So in terms of synthesis, there has to be profitability. So why would you create a chemical industry if there's no profit behind it, right? There needs to be a high demand for the product. So there needs to be a high demand. We want to make sure that the cost of production and availability of the product is, or cost of production being relatively low. And we also want the availability of resources to be relatively high. We need to also ensure that it's really efficient to make, and it's relatively accessible to get to our resources and transporting it to the necessary consumers that we need. Now, one example that is growing is the lithium-ion battery production in Australia. We actually know that in Australia, a lot of the lithium-ion batteries we make actually gets used up by Tesla. So there you go. That's our connection there with Tesla. We actually supply them with the lithium-ion batteries that's used in their cars. Sulfuric acid is actually a really common reagent that's used in industrial production of a lot of different types of chemicals. It just goes to show, if it really comes down to the idea, if it's not profitable, generally speaking, they don't try and go through that reaction type. So once we've gone through the social, economics, and the environmental impacts or factors that influence synthesis reactions, let's look at the actual reaction itself. What factors will influence the actual process? The first one is the availability of reagents. So what we talk about with reagents is obviously the reactants. It's an important factor to consider, as materials are often quite rare to use, or obviously there is a particular limitation. and so that will limit the capacity of production. So is rare, and so obviously that we can have limiting reagent effects there. Some companies might decide to synthesize their own reagents, so maybe if you are in need of a particular chemical, like sulfuric acid, you produce your own sulfuric acid in your own factory. The location of the plant also plays a role in terms of the availability of the products. Obviously, the closer you are to the resource, so the closer to resource, the better, obviously, closer to resource. In terms of reaction conditions, quite often these reaction conditions will rely on understanding of equilibrium principles. So that's Le Chatelier's principle, and also what we discussed in Module 5, the collision theory. So we're looking into these sort of ideas to help increase production rate of a desired product. So these factors could include manipulating temperature, pressure, using a catalyst, maybe removing the product, maybe changing the volume of the reaction vessel. There are multiple ways of considering, but each way the main goal is to maximize the yield of the product. Okay? From collision theory, we know that there are three things that matter with increasing the rate of collision. Okay? It is increasing the energy of the collision and improving the orientation of that set collision. If the orientation isn't right, we won't get a reaction. But at the same time, this collision may not even work if there's not sufficient amount of energy to cause that collision to begin with in the first place. Okay, so let's look at the elements of how temperature increases the rate of reaction. By increasing the temperature, particles will have more kinetic energy to collide with each other. Okay, so let's say in this diagram we have here, the original temperature we have, only a certain amount, so any particles that have this particular temperature range will be involved in our reaction. Okay, but if we were to increase the temperature, we increase the overall particles energy, and that will ensure that there are more particles. So by increasing temperature, the probability of collision, probability of particles with sufficient energy to collide will increase. So that's kind of the idea we're looking into there. Okay, so that's what increasing temperature does, and obviously it allows us to overcome all the activation energy barrier that we talked about before as well. Increasing pressure, that's another way of going about it. Now the Haber process, one way that we increase the production of ammonia gas is by decreasing the volume of the reaction vessel or increasing the pressure. So as we push or as we increase the pressure, remember the side of the equilibrium with more moles, okay, left hand side, will be shifted to the right because we increase the probability of collisions happening, as Le Chatelier's principle states, because there are greater collisions overall. Next we have is a chemical catalyst that helps lower our activation energy. So remember, a catalyst will lower the overall activation energy for both the forward and reverse reaction. So it doesn't necessarily help improve our yield, but it does improve the rate of the reaction. So that's the important part there. And that does it by increasing the effective collisions we have, because everything is orientated in a more correct order. Okay? So if we have a look at this question here, where's the shift? We have a chemical equilibrium here. What I want you to do is predict firstly the effects of each species before the system reaches equilibrium, so when we add a catalyst, and also after equilibrium has been reached, the rate of the forward and reverse actions due to this catalyst here. I'll pause it here if you want to have a go, but I'll go through the answer in 3 seconds. Okay, so what we have here, firstly, the system will reach equilibrium a lot quicker due to our catalyst because we're increasing the forward and backwards reaction. There is no change in the actual rates between forward and backwards. They are equal because it is just a catalyst, but it will help us reach equilibrium a lot faster because the changes will occur a lot faster as well. We also talked about Le Chatelier's principle back in Module 5 and a little bit of Module 6, but mostly Module 5. Le Chatelier's principle states that the equilibrium will act to minimize any change made to the system. So things that can affect our equilibrium is concentration of reactants and products, temperature, pressure, and having a catalyst. It doesn't affect the direction of the equilibrium, but it does ensure that the equilibrium reaches, or the reaction reaches equilibrium point a lot faster. So that's the idea we have. Yield and purity. So yield is the total amount of products formed from an initial reaction. The higher the purity of the desired product is obviously more desired. Okay, so factors that can affect our yield. If we lose some reactants during the synthesis project, so maybe if some spillage occurred, that can affect our overall yield. In a multiple step reaction, if it occurs simultaneously, we can increase impurities. So say for example we try and do crystallization of a saturated solution, we get really nice little crystals. However, the longer we take, or the longer it takes for the crystal to form, the purer the crystal will be, the bigger it will be. The faster we try and make the crystals occur, so maybe cooling it down, we'll get really tiny impure crystals. So that can occur there. So timing is also an issue. Reversibility of the reaction. So if the reaction is at equilibrium or can be easily shifted, then obviously that will affect how much we get. So example of that would be the Haber process. And obviously let's not forget the reaction conditions will affect it overall. So like we said before, concentration of reactants, temperature of the system, and pressure of the system. So the last thing we're going to just quickly make you do is identify where's the shift. So use Le Chatelier's principle to predict the effects of adding more hydrogen gas to the following equilibria. So if actually you can pause it here if you want, but I'm going to go through the answers at this stage here. So pause now. If not, I'm going through the answers. So if we increase hydrogen here, that's going to shift our equilibrium to the right, because we have more moles of the reactants over here. If we increase the concentration of hydrogen here, that's going to shift our equilibrium to the left. And also if we increase this, that's going to shift our equilibrium to the right there. See, it says an endothermic reaction occurring here. Justify whether the forward or reverse reaction is favored when we add more hydrogen. Well, in this case, it's going to go backwards. Obviously, increase collision. So increase collision of CO and H2. If we decrease the temperature, so this is our endothermic reaction. So this is endothermic, so heat is on this side here. If we decrease the temperature, that's going to cause this to move in reverse. More heat needs to be produced in our reaction to retain equilibrium. To maintain equilibrium. Okay, and then last one, if we increase the overall pressure. Now, if we look at it, we have 2 moles on the left-hand side and we have 4 moles on the right-hand side, which means by increasing pressure, that's going to shift our equilibrium to the left, as the right-hand side has more moles of molecules, hence a greater amount of collision. Okay, so that kind of gives you that. You can obviously use Le Chatelier's principle to explain it as well. So that's what we have here. Alright, so that kind of summarizes some of the factors that influence chemical synthesis. We looked at environment, social and economic factors. We also looked at the actual designing process of the reaction, what can affect it. We are going to go into a little bit more detail with a couple more case studies, but to what exactly they are, I haven't quite thought of yet. But if you are curious, please watch the next video. And if you just enjoyed watching this video overall, give it a like. If there's anything that confused you, please feel free to re-watch it at any point. Otherwise, have a good day and hope you enjoyed.